of places to look. But inside of that, there's some that are less pathologizing than others. So the one in the upper right hand, which is kind of probably hard for many of you to see, says divergence is a mental or neurologic function from what is considered typical or normal, frequently used with reference to autistic spectrum disorders. Very simplistic kind of definition that it's giving there, right? Divergence in mental and neurological function from what can be considered typical or normal. Now that can describe a lot of things. And the one on the lower left, neurodiversity, is a proposed framework that argues there is an intrinsic diversity in human brain function and cognition. I love this one. And that certain things currently classified as neurodevelopmental disorders are differences in disabilities, but are not necessarily pathological. And even within disabilities, I often will challenge that word. In that, the wide spanning umbrella, if we look underneath this, some of the things that we commonly think of: ADHD, autism, but then we get a much wider spanning process when you look at this particular umbrella: bipolar, dyslexia, schizophrenia. Who has thought of schizophrenia as neurodivergent? In sensory processing, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. A lot of these we do think of, but when you start to consider that we're defining this spread or this difference in the nervous system from the norm of the day-to-day, which, I'll talk about this idea of norms in a moment. It's often farther reaching than we think about, when you start to have this conversation. I'd be curious how many of you would have considered schizophrenia, for example, in the neurodivergent category, because if it's psychosis, which would often, fall into, how we would define that psychosis, how is that divergent from the norm of neural development, etc.? So it really starts to challenge our diagnostic world, and just the idea of the category of something like psychosis being neurodivergent. So again, this becomes a challenge when we start to use a term like neurodivergence, and it can be so wide spanning that it can include almost everything at that point in terms of mental health. And again, what is mental health or mental health disorder, etc.? A divergence from what we categorize as a norm. Go ahead and progress it, Mary Jo. So the idea of the norm of a nervous system, right? Nervous systems from the earliest developmental stages are designed by the environment that surrounds us. So it'd be like walking into each one of our homes and being able to have the exact matching home. How do we even norm homes and structures? And so the same with the nervous system, a network. When you view the nervous system through this window of 4 quadrillion connections, 4 quadrillion is a guesstimate. 4 quadrillion connections with networks that are operating in unison and independently. How do you start to norm such a complex system? So inside of that, now we start to have some ideas of norm based upon our day-to-day interactions with each other, etc. But what defines that? Inside of that, the idea of being diagnosed, and this was part of the challenge with the DSM system, was that how do we capture a wider net of these changes that we see? And in a widespread kind of diagnosis, as many of us would probably agree that ASD, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and Down syndrome, are pretty common ones that we're comfortable with. But I proposed that idea, and even looking at the idea of defining it and putting now some of our psychosis disorders with that. But if we're going to proceed in this conversation, the majority of what we're talking about in our presentations ahead fall into these categories. and or adjustments in cognition. And that was something very important in that last definition, like processing speed issues, etc. Lori will take a deep dive on a lot of that. So how do we define and even start to capture this? The educational system is one of the number one places where we see this rise and show itself upon initial identification. And there was an interesting time frame back when ADHD got very popular as a diagnosis, where Dr. Leonard Sachs did a study on all of the people coming through their educational system. And over 2/3 of these youth coming into the therapist and saying they were ADHD had been diagnosed or initially diagnosed by a teacher. And how much training in diagnosis, mental function, nervous system differences, how much training does a teacher or the education system really get in this? And so one element that we're even seeing now is that anything that becomes a challenge in the classroom quickly gets labeled and then falls into this category. And one of my bigger concerns about this is how much of this, when we see one of our students just become stressed, they just are stressed at home and there's conflict at home, or there's stress in a peer environment, begin to perform less and then fall into this category and quickly become labeled and then additionally medicated. It's a big thing and a big concern of mine personally. Let's progress, Mary Jo. I really, really encourage individuals to read and examine this book. Alan Francis and his writings about this are so essential in this time where stress is dominating many of our lives. Stress response is dominating many of our lives, and this idea of normal. And then the purpose and the development of the DSM-5. So Alan Francis's story is that he was one of the authors, and he very clearly articulates that the DSM-5 is being used in a way that it was never intended to be used. And again, we have to have a common language to talk about things as professionals and to help our children, our young adults, and even our adults that are struggling with functioning, and to be able to have some common knowledge as why diagnosis exists. But inside of it, the story of how far this went in terms of acquisition of benefits and insurance, all kinds of progressive misuse in the medical model is part of what his story is. And in that, he talks about the risk also in these wide spanning diagnoses. We see the value in being able to capture and see individuals and recognize them as needing additional support, right? That's ultimately what happens when they fall into this category of neurodivergent, is there's some additional support needed. And how do we not get so wide spanning that everybody falls into that category and then is labeled and then starts to have ramifications from either the medical world, the insurance world, etc. Progress it. So these adjustments to the diagnostic world have made these conversations in ways in specific that we start having these generalized conversations versus focused, specific attributes that have been identified. And that's the risk with diagnosis, right? Individualized, identified manifestations. And in that, being able to adjust our approach and discuss what's working to that individualized divergence from what might be deemed as normal. So we had some very specific diagnoses, right, that we utilized a lot. High functioning autism gave us an idea and was able to separate the capable of functioning from autism. Then we dropped to nonverbal learning disorder. These various disorders, we understood some of their attributes clearly. And when we go to a spectrum and see it so widely, now we have to be very careful and attentive as professionals to get into the individual characteristics that we're seeing, what's working, what's not working. Go ahead and progress it. So we know that there's trends, autistic spectrum disorder, having many attributes, right? That we will see in cross areas of, for example, social emotional reciprocity can be a problem in a highly activated ADHD individual, right? So we have to correlate stress response with this. And that's what my part of this conversation is really talking about here. When we are looking at stress, overall stress capability, we already know that when the midbrain in stress response mode is dominating the experience of a person's life, their capability in all these arenas is also going to be decreased. So this is where we have to quickly and carefully pull apart stress response versus day-to-day operation and continuous functioning throughout educational experience, social experience, etc. And we can see also when we look at even a child who's shows full autistic diagnosis, see things that we define, for example, in a rigid way, difficulty socially and emotionally, in that oftentimes people will take a neurological focused diagnosis and rule out capability of improvement. And so oftentimes individuals will take a neurological defined issue, for example, bipolar, and not get into the nitty gritty of how we individualize improvement for that individual. How do we know what somebody's social emotional capability is? It can be very wide spanning. And in that, we can work with some individuals with very difficult barriers in the way and still get improvement. And in that, that's where I get concerned about the diagnosis of a lot of the neurodivergent populations, is that we can improve, but we can do so gently, progressively, and inside of that, not exert our expectations upon a nervous system that in some ways is compromised on something that we're asking it to do. In addition to that, are we attesting to how stress is influencing that along the way? And we have to correlate and manage stress along with any of the work, therapeutic elements of what we're doing here. So to speed up, here are a lot of the criteria that a lot of the professionals in here know. Most of you are familiar with it. The social emotional reciprocity. I'm just going to zip through restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior. Lo and behold, somebody with a stress state does the same things to try to decrease their stress. So when we start to look at these also through an additionary lens of stress response and the behaviors that are associated in common with these labels, looking at, yes, controlling something repetitively brings me a sense of ease, that for this population, that a lot of times it's stress mitigation that we're working with also in unison to the neurological programming and biology elements that they have. So I'm not going to go through all that. Many of you are experienced enough. You can look up the specifics of the criteria, but I wanted to speak to the co-occurring element of stress and also the individualized approach of working on social emotional processing and capability and seeing how far we can improve it. And then things like being able to develop mental checklists that help them progress in some of these things. And so inside of that process of that progress, being able to find what works and communicate it from one professional to another and develop tools and skill sets for these individuals. Progress. So inside of that, there's a lot of statistics out there. I just wanted to note a couple quick. We've seen some significant increases for sure, but current statistics for children and autism, again, identification we know is an issue, 4 times higher in boys. 2.8% general population, 2.1% again estimated. These are through the CDC. ADHD, 9.8%, 2 times higher in boys. So we start to see a pattern here with neurodivergence inside of being identified in boys. Now, again, identification versus actual manifestation is a question that I pose when I look at these numbers. Because boys can be a challenge in the educational system in and of just their neurology in general, are they quicker to be identified to have this 2 times higher diagnosis? Dyslexia, this is the range they present, 5 to 20%. That's a very big range to be proposing statistically amongst dyslexics. Dyscalculia, 3 to 6%. Down syndrome, 1 in 700. One thing that I wanted to reference was one particular study, and I'm just gonna pull up my actual notes on that. In that the increase that we're seeing throughout time, we're seeing some jumps, and just in the last 5 years, there was a 1.5% increase was what the CDC had noted in autism particularly. So again, the question is identification getting better? Is there an actual increase in a number of individuals with it? As remains a major academic challenge to all of us. Progress. So inside of that, when you're looking at ADHD falling into this category, actually seeing a slight decrease from the span of 2003 to 2011, and then 2016 to 2019, a slight decrease in a percentage that we're seeing it identified. So again, my question with this slide is identification or overutilization of diagnosis, or is there an actually bona fide decrease that we're looking at? And these are all questions for us to be asking ourselves as professionals when we're looking at this. Progress it. So why wilderness? Again, we're going to go through that in detail, but just some things to think about, especially from a trauma-informed model perspective of connection before correction is our mentality in our program. So for us, social re-experiencing and diagnostic assessment obviously allows us to identify capability and work on capability to see where improvement exists. Inside of that, social re-experiencing in a responsive environment that's really, really responsive to stress is why a trauma responsive model is excellent for these youth. Inside of that, having multiple different forms of diagnosis and capability present inside of a milieu becomes extremely crucial in social learning process. How does one individual let another person know about their struggle, etc.? So the stress variables of wilderness show and allow us to tease out what is stress response related to my social struggle, and how much of it is my inability to actually read it or assess it accurately. So stress as a variable in the environment allows us to tease out and look at some of these things to be able to see accurately how much of it is stress correlated, and therefore then reducing stress and seeing if functioning increases. Expeditions in the milieu itself, a lot of these individuals that fall into a neurodivergent category have had social pain. And inside of that, how do we get them an experience with being able to have a time with others their age, not be alienated? The number one factor we actually really focus on in our programs around trauma is aloneness, not powerlessness, aloneness. And so to be able to counter the aloneness in this expedition and in this group milieu feel is a huge part of it. And there's so much opportunity for that in the teamwork immersion in the woods and how they're working together. The other part of it is the social diversity, being able to learn by watching and having people have successes socially in the environment that are really good socially, and then being able to see what that looks like versus being attacked, and being able to witness what social capability looks like is also an experiential learning process. To experientially learn and test your capability and see improvement through the experiential model. Progress. I believe here is where we hand off. So inside of that, oftentimes we find these young people that have these struggles and they discover their superpowers. Things like ADHD, for example, can be extremely effective for different roles in life. In fact, there was a study that showed that 2/3 of the CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies met the criteria for ADHD. So inside of being in the woods in a forgiving, stress responsive environment, we're able to work with them in a way and often find their strength inside of even the milieu, what they're good at and what they're not so good at. So everybody has their strengths and weaknesses. And inside of that, we can play off some strengths and get them good, positive social re-experiencing with that. Progress. Mary Jo froze. Yeah, okay, there we go.
That looks like that's my slide, Steve.
Yep, this is a handoff to you, Lori. So that's it on my part of things, and we'll let the clinical directors take off from there.
All right. Hello, everyone. Jennifer, I'm going to try to stick to 15 minutes to try to get us back on schedule. This is an abbreviated presentation of some work that Darren Reiner and I and Dana Doring presented at IECA. And it really came about by us recognizing here at Deschutes that, wow, we have a lot more students with neurodivergence showing up on our doorsteps. And like just looking at Steve's slide, and I was writing down the disorders and diagnoses and conditions that students currently with us right now have. We have students with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, sensory processing disorder, PTSD, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, bipolar disorder, highly sensitive persons, tic disorder, processing speed issues, working memory issues, and executive functioning issues. All right now at the Deschutes. And so looking at this real huge increase in neurodivergence was what led to bringing this type of presentation together. So we have been seeing increasing rates and deficits in all of these areas. The slides here are only reflective of rising rates of autism and parallel rates of increases in ADHD. May have tailed off a little bit on this data compared to Steve's maybe slight downtick recently. I remember, some of you have been around long enough, in the early 90s when it was like ADHD was the diagnosis du jour, and we thought we'd hit the we thought we hit the top, right? But we hadn't, guys, because here it is. I remember when I first started working in the autism field that, you know, it was like 1 in 300, and then suddenly it was 1 in 150, and everybody was scratching their head going, what is going on? So in the past 30 years, in the time I have been working in this industry, the rates of autism have gone from 3 in 1,000 to 3 in 100. And probably not, not like slowing down. Right now, the rate is 1 in 36. And if you look at Caucasians, it's actually 1 in 25. So our experience here at Deschutes, I think, reflects this increasing rate in general, and increasing rates and recognition of other sensory processing divergencies, whether it's highly sensitive people, sensory processing disorders, etc. In the clinical setting, we had Dana, I said, was presenting with us. What Dana reported that she had been seeing was students that were failing to perform in school at dramatically higher rates, not just less higher rates, right? Also, parents being even more overwhelmed, trying to support these deficits, and the schools being less prepared to support students with these needs. Because if we're seeing them, we're like the tip of the iceberg. Everyone else is seeing it as well at a bigger level. You can advance, Mary Jo. So challenges, I should let Darren do this because this was originally her slide, but I will go ahead and do it. Challenges that we're seeing just when they're hitting the door, okay? what was noticed is dramatic decreases in interest and actually investing energy and effort into pursuing those interests. So prior to 2020, probably 80 or 90% of the students we were seeing were coming in with, wow, they're really interested in, I don't know, rock climbing, aerobics, fossil collecting, and they were pursuing that. Now, when a parent presents with a child, they're presenting with, oh, they have no interests, or they used to have interests, but they're not doing anything. And it's really a small percentage of students who are showing up in wilderness right now who are interested in pursuing anything. We're seeing extreme task avoidance and refusal. And I think that is related to some of what Steve was talking about. We have students with a heightened level of sensory processing sensitivity and a really narrow window of tolerance for that. And connected to their sensory processing challenges are, of course, the emotional functioning. Those things are really connected in the nervous system. And those two pieces together, of course, create the social communication and socialization challenges that we're seeing. So that results in extreme task avoidance and refusal. As I said, the window of tolerance is narrowed excessively. Many of the students are coming in with multiple treatment failures without adequate explanation, like based on the diagnosis they have, this should have been successful, but yet it wasn't. And then oftentimes Darren is seeing a lot of confusion or disagreement about what the child's problems are and or how they present. So one person in the child's life will see them one way, another person will see them dramatically differently. And that is creating a huge question mark when the child arrives. Mary Jo, you can advance, please. So treatment program considerations, things that we've been kind of looking at a broader level. So despite the rising prevalence of these deficits and disorders and divergencies, many students presenting to treatment programs have either not been diagnosed with any form of neurodivergence, have been misdiagnosed, or have only been partially diagnosed. So when I rattled off to you all the diagnoses and divergencies that are currently with us, in part with the students that are with us right now, many of those were not diagnosed coming in, right? The student came in thinking, I'm stupid, I'm a failure, I'm a bad person. And it's like, yeah, well, really, you have some neurodivergencies like sensory processing issues that create challenges for you that haven't been recognized. And you've been told all this time you're oppositional, but that's not really what's at the basis of the problem. Our assigned female at birth students are much, much more likely to be under the radar. We know that. But most of our students coming in that are assigned female at birth have not received a diagnosis of neurodivergence. And in fact, they receive it usually when they're here. So a student will come in and we'll scratch our head and go, this is not the whole story. Something else is going on. Let's evaluate. And yes, they have a nonverbal learning disorder. They have sensory processing disorder. They have autism spectrum disorder or other sensitivities. Unfortunately, for the assigned females at birth, their challenges are often written off as being due to anxiety or depression, right? 100% of these students are coming in reporting high levels of anxiety. Again, they're utterly overwhelmed. Their nervous system is flooded. So programs have to be increasingly curious and suspicious when clinical history does not seem to tell the complete story, or some aspects just don't seem to fit the picture as described. And we find that a lot on applications and students coming in and scratching our heads and going, this doesn't seem right. We're probably going to want to do assessment when this student gets here. Let's prepare the parents for that. And then finally, from the treatment program end, suspecting that a student may be neurodivergent or neurodiverse from admission creates a better opportunity for attunement of interventions, more rapid stabilization, and asking the right questions on assessment that helps us help that student, A, figure out who they are, what's really underneath all of this stuff, and learn how to begin managing their own nervous systems. You can advance, Mary Jo. So what are we doing with our staff and how are we training them? Because obviously, like, it's not just one type of neurodivergence. There's lots of different presentations and challenges here, but I think we boil it down to a lot of sensory processing sensitivities, decreased window of tolerance, and dysregulated nervous systems that are showing up. And so number one thing, it works really well in the woods, but our staff still need to be reminded, is to slow things down, right? Our students, these students have so much coming at their systems, so much coming at trying to process sensory information, social information, etc. They really need the world to slow down. Also, talk less. One of the biggest challenges for our staff and our parents, and probably us sometimes, is to figure out, why am I talking, right? Speak less, give the student a chance to respond. Reduce the noise. Like any group of adolescents or even emerging adults, kids can be noisy sometimes, and you will see the students with these sensitivities really becoming dysregulated. So how do we reduce the noise and work on either giving outlets for the noisy stuff and the students who can't tolerate it not needing to be part of that? The fourth thing that I'm constantly teaching is to wait, wait, wait. It feels socially hard, bizarre, really off-putting when you ask a question and you're waiting for 30 seconds for a student to process and be able to respond. But if you do wait, the student often can respond. If you don't wait, you're providing more and more information for them to continue to try to process. And what you're going to end up with is either dysregulation or I don't know, because they literally don't in that moment. Next, to talk in pictures and to make more use of visuals. Students with many of these neurodivergencies really are visual learners, and to try to use visuals to our advantage. I use this as an example. We had a student recently who was on the autism spectrum, and he had trouble with sequencing, like many people do. And one of the sequencing issues he had was, how do you actually toilet in the woods and have proper hygiene? Well, in the autism world, there are all sorts of visuals of, like, here's the proper way to use a toilet. So I'm proud to say Deschutes has a wilderness version of how do you poop in a hole for kids on the autism spectrum. Schedule, predict, and write it down. Many times we have worked to try to keep the students present, right? Our efforts have been, don't predict what's coming next, because we want the students not to be thinking about that, to be present. Well, guess what? With a bunch of neurodivergent students, you need to have a schedule. It needs to be predictable. It needs to be written down, because that's how they manage anxiety and surprise when they didn't see it coming, because I didn't read the social cues that it was coming. Keeping in mind that sensory issues are real and not just preferences. Right? If a student comes in and says, oh, this shirt is just itchy to me, and we go, yeah, it's fleece, like, live with it, kid, right? Because that's just a preference. No, these are real issues that then have to be addressed. So we really work with our logistics team on paying attention to the sensory sensitivities that our students have. An important one, and it's hard for me to do many times because I use a lot of analogy and metaphor like most clinicians, say what you mean and mean what you say. Right? If you use analogy, this student is not going to understand it. And if you also say, we're going to be leaving in 2 minutes, you better be leaving in 2 minutes, because otherwise you're going to have a bunch of dysregulated students who are expecting 2 minutes when you really meant maybe 10. So being more precise in our communication. Simplify. One thing at a time, right? Don't ask the student, go pack down, get your day pack, come back to the group and get breakfast going, because only one of those things is maybe going to happen, or more than likely the student's going to stand there and be confused. Translate social behavior and scaffold for understanding. I have a student right now who is textbook, if there is such a thing, of someone on the autism spectrum, and we literally have him working with a guide, sitting adjacent to the group every day, observing and determining, deciphering what are the social rules of what is happening right now, and how do we help support you to follow those rules. Sometimes they come up with interesting ones. The one he came up with the other day, when I asked him, what social rule are you seeing right now in the group? The only one he remembered was, we don't bother this other student about how much peanut butter he's using. I'm like, okay, that's a social rule, not the one I had in mind, but good you notice that. Have realistic expectations, right? Many times it's not that a student with various neurodivergency can't do or won't do. Many times it's not that they won't do. Sometimes it's that they can't do the way we have the task demands set up. If we can provide scaffolding and support, we might be surprised at how much they can do and how much progress they can make. And finally, recognize the role of rigidity, right? Rigidity is like freeze. I can't go any further. I'm stuck here, right? So if you keep pushing on that, you're just going to push that student further into dysregulation. So create easy outs for them that are socially appealing and acceptable. So these are the pieces that we're working on sort of at a general level with all of the various neurodivergencies that we're working with at Deschutes. And I think that is my last slide. And Jennifer, I think I did it. So I will pass off to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Lori. And I'm going to kind of add another treatment tool and talk a little bit about playful engagement. And this is something that I am extremely passionate about as a registered play therapist. I believe it is an essential tool in the toolbox of every staff, clinician. And so I'll try not to get off on a tangent of a plug for play, but so I want to draw attention to this picture. This is a 17-year-old male in our group. And he had challenges engaging with other peers socially. He was or is ASD, we say ASD high functioning or level 1, and strong desire to interact with his peers, but was experiencing challenges. So anyway, he used this pack and used a sit pad and a plastic box and filled it with acorns, and then had other acorns on the side that he was using as currency. And he was going around and playing with the members in the group and pretending that he was selling peanuts at a baseball game. So I had the whole group, creating this role play and engaging with the group, and just really gave him the confidence to be able to interact and, interact playfully with the group, and opportunities to spend time with his peers. So I think that's beautiful. Next slide, Mary Jo. So we'll start out with, there we go. We'll start out with just a simple definition, and it's just what it sounds, right? Playful engagement is engaging students, engaging others through playful interaction, providing opportunities for connection and growth through play. So really considering this as an intervention that we're able to use in the field and as staff and clinicians to help foster and facilitate connection and growth in the milieu. Playful engagement produces warmth and trust between caregivers and children. So again, another connecting principle. It disarms fear, promotes attachment, and builds social competence. So referencing the student in the slide before, where he often experienced a lack of social competence, he was able to facilitate this play activity that helped him to feel confident in a way that's unique to him and was well received by his peers. Engaging playfully helps to ease fears and limits the fight, flight, or freeze reaction. So it brings us back into the social engagement zone. We had a new an admission not long ago. A student came in, fairly tough exterior, was very much so activated in nervous system response. And, we're providing, the physical safety and offering food and drink and promoting, promoting just that element of safety throughout the admission process and slowing it down. And so I'd walked upstairs for a minute, I came down and I'm coming down the stairs and I hear laughing. And I was like, okay, we're moving in the right direction. And the student was putting on their socks and had joked that the lining in the socks felt like bear fur. And so our field director was like, it is bear fur. So they're kind of playing back and forth in this playful interaction. And then I was able to join in and we were talking about bear fur socks. And, of course, it wasn't really bear fur, right? We don't have any bear fur socks. But the opportunity to laugh really ease the student and help them to feel safer and more connected to the caregivers in that moment, and ultimately was able to ease into the field in a safer space and a more regulated space, leaving the office. Next slide, Mary Jo. So this is all the essential elements that one can keep in mind that really contribute to this overall idea of playful engagement. And I want to draw attention to the top two circles, which are the largest, because those are the most essential elements of playful engagements, although everything else is extremely important. But we're looking at the positive affect, facilitating or projecting positive emotion through our expression. This can look like enthusiasm, energy, cheerfulness, joy. We really emphasize the opportunities for all students to experience joy within the milieu. And then the engagement piece, we're looking at really emphasizing meeting the student where they are at, and engaging them on the level that is comfortable to them, and to create that feeling of safety. Then we have some other elements, and you all, I won't go through each one to keep us on time, but the social initiation, taking cues from the students, right? Social responsiveness, giving and reading nonverbal cues, flexibility, being able to experience laughter with the students, imitation, and then just the joint attention, the dual attunement. Next slide, Mary Jo. So this is one of my favorite quotes. I'm sure many of you have heard of this. You can discover more about a person in an hour of play than in a year of conversation. I think it is one of the most important and best ways to learn about the students and the milieu is to sit back. I come to the field area and I'll kind of sit back and watch and the interactions, and sometimes they'll be having some free play time, which I say is extremely essential, just as essential as sleep time and eating time. Playtime, even in a high intensive treatment setting, is extremely important to the development of the student. But just sitting back and watching the interactions and the plays that are happening can really tell us a lot about the inner worlds of the students, how they interact, how they see themselves. So it's just extremely important. Play is a primary process of motion. It originates in our downstairs brain, so in our primitive brain. So it's something that is developed and comes innate and natural. So the primitive brain, one of the first areas of the brain to be developed. You don't have to teach play. There's all different in our, neurodiverse continuum, or not even continuum, but neurodiverse world. There's all different types of play and ways that the students are initiating play. But it's unique, but it's something that comes natural. Play begins in early childhood and is essential for each stage of development, continuing it into puberty. There is a growing body of research that really emphasizes the importance of playful engagement and the opportunity for play within the adolescent and above population. I think, sometimes it's categorized, even play therapy was categorized as most effective till around age 12. Or as a primary modality, but there's a lot of continued research that really talks about the importance of this intervention and opportunity for adolescents, or for students all the way up into adolescence. And then play doesn't discriminate. Brain architecture or neurological process, again, it allows us to meet our students where they are at. There's no optimal way to play, and an adolescent can't fail at play. It can look different, but what they're initiating, they can't fail. It's a tool that can be used to really empower students. And then play is a particularly effective way to bridge the gap between clinician and adolescent. So when we let the student lead and we engage with them in this way, we can learn so much about them. Their frustration tolerance, their emotions, their inner world, and just really overall more about who they are as a person. I want to draw attention to one of our students in the milieu had a really strong interest in building different structures around the group. And so this is one of their many structures. They often, anytime we move to a new site, they would build a chair for them to utilize within the group milieu. Very high energy, right? And really put a lot and was always experienced so much pride. So he has sit pads and then use different material from around the campsite to produce that. So super, super cute. Next slide, Mary Jo. So the benefits of engaging in play.
Jennifer, I think you're muted.
Oh, no, I have no idea how that happened, Mary Jo. Thank you. So I'll start back. So we talk a little bit about the dopamine release that comes with the ability to explore novelty, excitement, increases well-being, feelings of well-being for all students. And we know that students that are having opportunities to experience well-being are able to allow themselves to go deeper into the hard stuff that we're often, working with them to get to within the program. It creates and channels energetic arousal in a healthy direction. We have some squirrely kiddos, right? We have a lot of, I guess I hesitate to classify in the ADHD, but, we have a lot that come in with high energy impulse, but it helps to channel the energetic arousal, giving them the opportunity to play and interact in that way. And ultimately, it can expand the window of tolerance with new material in a non-threatening way. So it allows a student to safely titrate in and explore hard stuff. Hard stuff may be connection with others, right? So if it's characterized in a playful way, then that connection feels a little less threatening to them, and they're able to explore it a little bit further and see how it feels. And allows them to explore new environments, thoughts, and ideas. So ultimately, it's a great tool for helping to expand the window of tolerance in a safe way. It increases their ability to explore and alter plans and practices with controlling focus and attention. We have a student previously that every hike day was always the first one to pack up and get everybody moving, and was very on the schedule, right? And that was something that was an attribute of this particular student that we attuned to and acknowledged. And what was challenging is when they had everything packed up and ready and the rest of the group was not on that same schedule. And so we were able to really name that as his superpower. That he was able to really get things moving and pack up and get things in order, and that he had such an amazing superpower to be able to share with others. And when he was doing that, we could name it that and really encourage him to use his superpower to help and encourage his peers. And so that was a really positive way of using playful engagement in that way. Next slide, Mary Jo. So I'm just going to talk just for a couple minutes of another case example of a student that we were really utilizing, this idea of play and playful engagement. I'll talk a little bit more about the quote in a second, but was this previous 16-year-old male. I'll change a couple of the details, but challenges with substance use, impulsivity, low self-worth, sense of identity, wrapped up in, affiliation with what they would name crime, also experienced anxiety and a heightened arousal response much of the time, was also extremely creative, artistic, deep thinker, extremely intelligent. And when you hit him at the right time, would be really playful. And we noted that about him. So we really, really tapped into that element of him really use that opportunity to explore different themes and to help connect. But so this was a structure that he created, and it's a military like fort. So when I pulled up to the field, student and staff were all in the woods playing military, but just right around the group area, just hiding behind trees, and they were holding their little canteens and playing and interacting. And I sat back and watched for a minute and just really could feel the joy that they were experiencing, and also the value of what was happening, because there was connection with staff. This was a student who wasn't allowing himself the space to play, and wasn't allowing himself to see his identity in any other way than the initial core belief of himself that there's something wrong with me, and that I'm not valued. So we were able to really, really acknowledge that, you know, he had the opportunity to explore this other identity that he wasn't allowing himself through talk or other intervention, through the opportunity to play and connect with staff, utilize energy, and just exploring that part of himself that he hadn't ever been able to explore. And so one of the quotes that he shared at the end of that was, "I've never had the opportunity to just be a boy and play." So such a sweet case, such a sweet kiddo. I hope that I've put in a little bit of a plug for the importance. I think it's extremely important for our neurodiverse minds, for all the reasons that I talked about. And then I'm going to pass it along. I think that's it for me, to Nicole, who's going to bring us up. There we go.
Hi, everyone. Please bear with me. I may start to lose my voice as I give this presentation. Allergies have kicked in big time this year. So I'm going to be presenting a case example of healing inside a trauma responsive milieu. And so really, this is me getting to introduce you to one of my former students, Fred. Fred came to us as a 12-year-old here in New Vision Wilderness in Wisconsin, and he was number 4 of 10 kiddos. And parents were really worried about him kind of having that middle child, getting lost, not really being able to get the attention that he needed because he was that middle child. Some of the things that were showing up at home were unmotivation, addiction to screens, unwilling to obey, as parents put it, rarely apologizing, lots of blaming, fighting with siblings, easily offended, isolative, and really knowing that loud noises were difficult for him. He would oftentimes not eat with the family and spend all of his time in his bedroom. And then when he was out of his bedroom, it was a lot of yelling and instigating fights. At school, this looked like really getting into certain subjects, such as math, being very bright, telling other people that they were often wrong, but then getting to a point of really struggling and refusing to go to school, and refusing to do basic tasks. Socially, he knew that he had a very difficult time talking to people. He really wasn't able to engage socially, didn't know what to say to people, and also didn't feel like they had anything important to say to him. Next slide, please, Mary Jo. So with Fred coming to us in this way, we knew something was going on, right? And we knew we really needed to help Fred come in and help us figure out the assessment piece of what was going on. And how we do that in that trauma responsive milieu is truly through the CASA framework. And hopefully many of you have heard of our CASA framework. And so the slide here shows a picture of the idea of we as the caregiver are the driving force for this. We're there to show the child the commitment of we are here with you. We are going to be with you no matter what you throw at us. We move towards the idea of acceptance. We accept the kiddos wherever they're at, as both Lori and Jennifer shared. We are meeting these kids with their different sensory concerns, with their different social aspects. We're looking for new ways to engage with them because things previously really haven't worked. And so that's really where that acceptance of like, no matter what you show us, we accept you. And then really security within that relationship, right? That consistency, that constantly showing up, that willingness to work with them, all really presents that security within structure, as well as, then allowing us to attune to where the kiddo is, especially when they're feeling really dysregulated, in order to help them co-regulate with us. And so we're really doing that over and over again within the milieu, both as therapists, but also as field guides. So any interaction they're having with any of our staff is truly within this framework of, hey, we got you no matter what comes up. And so CASA in action with Fred really looked at us looking at his sensory pieces. As Lori mentioned, wool is definitely a difficult thing for many of our kiddos to experience, or different socks. And so really being mindful of the types of clothes that we're giving to our students and helping them to figure out what works and what doesn't. Fred had a very difficult time with tags. So a lot of his clothes had tags removed from them, which I think is also one of the great things society has started to do overall, is not putting tags into their clothes. The other big thing with Fred was texture of food. I can relate to that. I have a very difficult time with certain textures of food, and so did Fred. And so really working with Fred on learning how to have new experiences with food, be willing to try new foods, but also having a respect of like, let's figure out what works for you and what doesn't. As Lori mentioned, waiting was a huge thing, giving time for Fred. The noises sometimes in the field were very difficult for him, such as the sounds of the mosquitoes, or the sounds of the birds really early in the morning. The only sound he really liked was frogs. He was obsessed with frogs. And so really having the patience and helping him to co-regulate with us, using heart math during that time was really important. Obsessions, as I said, Fred was obsessed with frogs. He tried to collect as many frogs as he could. Anytime he saw a frog, he would try to catch it. There were times when Fred would randomly have a frog in his pocket, and we would have to coax him to let the frog go. And so that was just one observation of his obsession while he was with us, but it also showed up in other ways too. And so this is when we started to really question what was going on. And like many of the students that we've talked about, Fred wasn't diagnosed as ASD when he first got to us. That happened because of the things we were noticing, and finally the testing that we were able to get done. And so it took the opportunity to help give Fred the answers, but also help to give his parents the answers. And so most, as we know, most families and most kiddos, especially now and today, they're not picking up on the higher functioning of autism and how that really does interact and how it does show up. Fred definitely came to us with some of those, what parents called the ODD behaviors. And so by us being able to create structure, by us being able to wait Fred out, we were able to see it wasn't necessarily that Fred was trying to specifically oppose things, it was that he didn't always comprehend what was being asked, or too many things were being asked of him at once. And so really allowing things to be broken down and simplified was huge for Fred. And this is where we had to repeat. And that consistency of our field staff, I can, as I even think about Fred's time in the woods and my time with Fred, I have 2 field guides that were on opposite shifts that the compassion and grace and work that they did with Fred just brings joy to my own heart, because they truly stepped into this CASA framework in supporting Fred in his journey. And that's where the attuning comes in. And we do that over and over again. Next, you can go forward, Mary Jo, thank you. So a big part of also working with neurodivergence in the woods is also managing expectations, right? Families send their kiddos to us and they have, these are my expectations. This is what I'm hoping my kiddo is going to experience. Fred also had expectations and things he hoped to experience. One of them was returning home and being able to sleep in his own bed. We had to manage his, hey, you're going to be here for a little bit. How do we help you acclimate? For his parents, it was truly about, Fred might be different than some of your other kids. Fred has different struggles. You guys have been struggling for a while now, but let's find the answers and get to the root issues so that we can figure out how best to support and move forward. It took a lot of time with the psychoeducation for parents and Fred. And, it took them a while to also be able to accept some of the differences. And as many of us have experienced, the idea of being diagnosed on the spectrum definitely has had some very negative connotations to it. And really bringing that awareness, as Jennifer mentioned, these can actually be superpowers, right? These are actually ways that they can grow and do amazing things and think differently than some of us might. And so really helping parents to understand that. We also have to manage our own expectations as the provider of what this kiddo is going to experience, right? When we read, an application and have a kiddo coming in, we can sometimes get these really lofty goals of all the things that we think a kiddo can accomplish while they're with us. And sometimes it is truly about managing our own expectations for that kiddo and truly meeting them where they're at and dialing it back and simplifying things in order to really support them. And again, it's that consistent repeating of all of these things. We want to provide support, we want to provide understanding, and we want to do it all with grace. Advance, please. So one of the really cool things about Fred is Fred came from a very large family. They didn't have a lot of means. And Fred's parents were very adamant that they wanted Fred to come home. Luckily, they lived in Oregon, where there's a lot of supports for kiddos on the spectrum. And so we were able to find some really great wraparound services for Fred and came up with a really solid home plan for Fred. And so I had the opportunity to hear from parents every once in a while of how Fred was doing during his transition. And they were amazed at Fred spending time with the family and not hiding out in his room. Fred being able to vocalize how he was feeling and what he needed. When he was feeling overwhelmed, he could share that with his family and take the space that he needed as well. That was huge for Fred. The best part, and where this picture comes from, is this is Fred. Fred, I just received an email from mom yesterday, actually. Fred is graduating high school. Fred was able to take AP classes. Fred was able to take a different path and really lean more towards the trades. And I want to share with you guys one of the things that Fred still talks about his time in the woods. And Fred says that his time in Wisconsin was a pivotal point in his life. It really changed things for him and allowed him to shift things in a very new and unique way. And at this point, as Fred graduates, he's getting ready to look into construction and maybe go into engineering as he continues to really enjoy building and developing things. So because Fred was able to be in our milieu and to really be able to participate in this trauma responsive milieu and get the acceptance that he needed and get to the root issues of what was going on, he was able to really take all of his superpowers and be a healthy influence in his family, and also move towards very strong goals that he had for himself. So I'm going to open it up for questions. I believe this is the time for that. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Mary Jo, to facilitate that piece.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We wanted to make sure that there was a few minutes for questions, comments, anything that folks would like to share or ask of our team. And anybody's welcome to pipe in. Just take yourself off mute and ask, or you can put something in the chat as well.
I have a question. I'm Jennifer Griffith. I was wondering, is there, I guess, in terms of generalization of skill sets, when I think of the neurodivergent population, because I've been blessed to be able to serve this community and part of the community for quite some time. And I was just wondering, do you see any regression in certain skill sets, or are they able to take a lot of the skill sets that you're imbuing over time?
So my perspective on it, Jennifer, is that, right, when you're working with neural divergence, right, it's the neurological based process, right? You're in a way working on with rewiring, right? And so it takes a lot of time and practice and experience, right, to be able to take those skills on. That's why I love the immersion factor of the environment we're working in that way. So that, but in addition to that, part of it, and this is how we train our clinicians as a whole, which is like to systematize what we learn, right? It was like Lori talking about the young man looking into the milieu and doing social assessment capability, right? And then what are your 3 takeaways of what's happening socially right now? And that's an experience with that. But then we can also work with them that develop. And what's fascinating for many neurodivergent people, if you give them a structure to follow, like a social structure, for example, before you engage in a conversation, number 1, check your distance, right? Number 2, what's the current social interaction I'm stepping into, and number 3, watch my volume, or do I have material to share that's in alignment to what they're talking about?
Right.
Basic 1, 2, 3s, right? Like is as how some of these individuals can just transform socially. So we have to keep it simple, but we're also working on a very complex system and structure, right? And then, as I mentioned earlier, stress influences all that. So, but we do see kids walk away with these capabilities. I mean, for this young man to come in so compromised that Nicole just talked about, to be considering engineering school, like, man, and that'd be interesting to ask him, what is he using now? What is he using now? But one thing that's nice about neurodivergent people is if they suck it in and they embody the structure that you give them, that's where the rigidity becomes an asset instead of a loss, because then it's like every social. Yeah.
Absolutely. I agree with that. I was like, there's healthy lists for OCD, being able to cross things off. you know? I was just
Right.
curious if that was, you know, just something, because you've been in this for so long. Has that ever been feedback about the demographic in the outdoor behavioral arena? Because I figured I would ask.
There's other professionals on here would probably be able to say better than I could on that. You know, we're so in the trenches a lot of times with it, that kind of ongoing conversation, but overall stabilization and social capability, absolutely. I mean, the reputation of having a dynamic impact there is there for sure. And because it's so small
Yeah.
too, we didn't really talk about the size of the milieu, that a lot of times professionals don't realize it in wilderness milieu, you know, usually max 8-9 students, right, to 3 staff ratio. So the containment factor of that, you know.
This
I
is
love the
Betsy.
wilderness model. Sorry.
Yeah.
I just wanted
Yeah.
to ask about that.
Yeah. Hi, this is Betsy Gregoriou. This is related to this question because I think it's really important for consultants. So to give you an example, right now I have a 15-year-old boy who is on the spectrum. He's getting ready to graduate from a wilderness program, and making a recommendation to programs and schools, you know, this is what they want to know. They want to, you know, the kid's doing great in wilderness, the routine, the structure, you know, build up stress tolerance, etc. So the big question is, okay, that's great and wonderful, but, you know, what's it look like outside of that structure? That's what schools and programs are trying to assess. And, you know, as consultants, we have to be able to, you know, get that information from the wilderness program, the therapist, to try to, you know, give a realistic assessment of, you know, how is this kid most likely to function outside of this environment that they're doing very well. So it is a really great question.
You know, one of the things I was thinking of with the previous question and this one is, in addition to obviously working with the student themselves, you're also working with the primary container for that student, meaning the family, when the student leaves. And the student themselves, as well as the providers and the family, are learning about what are the structures and supports that this student needs to be successful. As the student learns, like, you know, I can't really be around loud noises. These are the things I need to do when that happens. They can take that to the next setting. I think the translation from like wilderness to another therapeutic program is, yes, here's what the student has gained. And the second piece of is these are the structures and supports that this student needs to be successful. And the student internalizing some of that, right? So they can self-regulate and manage. That'd be my,
And
that was
self-advocate
coming up.
too, right?
Yeah.
I love
Yeah.
what I love to see for this population is their ability to understand themselves in a way that they start self-advocacy ultimately, right? True empowerment.
And to piggyback off that, you know, I've had students that like have come up with their own tools that have helped them to accomplish the different tasks. You know, I had one student that came up with his own mantra about how he could do things. That was a motivating factor for him, especially when he didn't want to do something. So it's really about also building that scaffolding in helping the kiddos figure out the tools and then adapting those tools for themselves versus us putting that on them. You know, the idea of, hey, we're going to do this for you. We're going to do it with you. And then we're going to let you figure it out and do it on your own with our support. Like that's a huge part of that milieu. So that they can take it on to the next place, right? Like that's what we want to see happen.
Yeah, I think the question may not be posed accurately. So everything that everybody's just described is true. And, as consultants, we work with a primary therapist to establish placement criteria, articulating, okay, this is what the child has gained, this is how they're functioning, this is what they need in this next setting. And the question, really that schools and programs are assessing is, okay, that's all well and good, but, on this kid's worst day, what's it look like? Because you're asking this child to take all of these skills that he or she has learned, and there's a high expectation that they're going to be able to continue to implement them and practice them. But, we all know that any kind of new environment is going to have its own stressors, and the question that schools are trying to, determine is just what level of risk are they taking on.
Yeah, and to communicate that, and also even to assess, right, to predict, right, because of the bubble that they're in inside of wilderness, right, and going on to these next steps, is such a difficult factor, right? Even if we isolate some of the factors, just the wilderness itself, the sensory input material often is far less, right, than what they're going to deal with in any other environment.
Yeah,
and so
exactly.
it's difficult